Hi there, y'all. We are having a discussion about whether Little Women's moralistic message of self-denial and emotional repression is dangerous and unhealthy. I'm Kathleen.
I'm Michaela.
And I'm Natalie.
And we're going to be kind of talking about our own experiences, also with the expertise of Stephanie Foote and her article, Resentful Little Women.
Yes. All right. So if we get going here, maybe just like a good place to start is initial impressions of Stephanie's article. What did you find the most interesting that she said? Or something that challenged you the most as you were reading, some anecdote, and we can kind of go from there.
I like that she kind of advanced the conversation from earlier feminist criticism of the 80s, which in general said that the Little Women were almost entirely oppressed and encouraged not to have negative emotions or act on them. And I like that she took a more nuanced approach to that and developed it in her own way.
Yeah, I liked the way that she kind of contrasted Amy and Joe and the way that they interacted in the social sphere, particularly contrasting part 1 and part 2, because in part 1, Amy is kind of punished for her focus on her peers' impressions of her with the limes in the chapter Amy's Valley of Humiliation. And Joe is rewarded for her kind of disregard, and she gets freedom. Whereas in part 2, Amy's care for the debts of society, as she says, gets her to Europe, while Joe is left with little or less freedom.
Yeah, it's interesting that she kind of reframes the idea of repression through the lens of utility, like how useful is repression going to be for you? And she essentially says that Amy, by adhering to social conventions, or learning to, especially in part 2, is actually advancing herself much more effectively than Joe does in repressing those things, and so she's making her way in the world through repression.
Yeah, this is the point that I noted, and I don't know, I'm very interested in is she has, I think her premise is that emotions have to be useful, not necessarily Foote's idea, but the Little Women idea is that emotions should be useful, and so if they're not useful, they're not helping you. That sounds dumb, but you know what I mean?
Self-destructive.
Exactly. They're not, and I think by useful, the idea is then that they're advancing your place in the world, not necessarily social climbing, but they're helping people around you, or helping you social climb. So her idea, the differentiation she makes between Amy and Joe, especially in part 2, is that Amy has learned how to, her words were, use critical emotion. Use her emotion as a venue for action, whereas Joe kind of just gets angry at the world, but doesn't know how to channel that into a critical strategy to move forward. She kind of runs away from her problems a little bit, and just feels all of her emotion. And so I think the argument then is the lesson that Marmee was trying to teach her was not if we go back to Joe versus Apollyon, not necessarily repress your anger, but channel it. But I was really interested in that because Foote raised that scene at the beginning, but she never touched on it again.
Yeah.
And I felt super unresolved by that because I was her points in the latter half of her article about critical emotion versus just emotion made sense, but not in that setting. I don't know. Do you guys have thoughts on that chapter?
Yeah, well, I think as a little girl watching the movies, I was always very didn't understand what was going on. I didn't understand why there were so many high emotions and why Joe seemed to be at the center of it all. And I really appreciated the way that Foote introduced that chapter, and she was like, okay, I think that we do need to talk about this because I think it does have some problematic things, but like you said, she didn't ever come back to it. And so it was kind of just left floating. And so she talked about how many people, many scholars will ignore the whole scene. And you can't ignore the whole scene, but that for her, the problem that she had was they were talking about Joe's anger, and Joe is concerned that someday she's going to do something that's going to make everyone hate her, and she's going to ruin something. And, you know, like, she has to get a hold of this. But Foote was like, well, Amy already did something. She already did something that caused hatred. She already did something that is irreversible, and we have no discussion on Amy's...
Well, her running her life.
Yeah.
In that way.
Right.
I couldn't help but wonder, because that was a great question Foote raised. And I can't help but wonder if anger is far more of an issue for Joe and Marmee than it would have been for Amy. And if Amy had a sort of, not complacent personality, but a desire to please, and that she would have let it go, and it wouldn't have consumed her in the same way that consumed Joe. So even if the call was wrong and unfair, maybe Marmee discerned that difference in them, and that's why she didn't scold Amy. And she didn't even scold Joe, but she saw that there's a much greater danger for Joe in that.
See, sorry.
No, go ahead, yeah.
I can understand it not being a problem for Amy, because we don't really see other instances like that. But I just thought that I really liked the way that Foote represented it, because she was talking about how Joe was really concerned, and she says, when I get into a passion, I could do anything. And I'm concerned because I could do anything. But the whole point was Amy was in a passion. And there were people there. Marmee was at home. Beth was at home. It's not like she was alone. Bingo. It's not like she was unsupervised. She was in a passion. She wanted to hurt Joe, and she wanted it to be permanent. And so she burns the manuscript of something that we're led to believe is this giant big thing, and then it's just completely moved on. And so I don't think that there was enough time or any kind of justification given to Joe that, like, okay, your anger is justified. It isn't, like you said, it's not useful. It's not going to get you anywhere. And so maybe we should try and figure out how to, like, move past it. But it isn't useful. But you should feel this way, because what she did was wrong, and she did it to hurt you. And I didn't feel like there was ever any resolution, and I don't think that Foote really ever gave any resolution either.
Absolutely. I think that's super interesting, especially like in light of this idea of moral education, and as we see like things that work for Amy and don't work for Joe later in the novel. She talks about, so like you just mentioned, Joe is never validated in that anger, and I'm so interested in thinking about that as she moves on and doesn't know how to channel her emotions productively. Is this perhaps one of the things why? Because Amy is validated in ways that maybe Joe isn't. Like, Marmee still, and I think Foote raises this, Marmee still tells Amy, hey, this was partially your fault. Like, the limes and the stuff, but, like, not that she's petted, but her emotions are kind of validated in a way, and then she's taught what to do with them. Whereas, is it with Joe that Marmee's like, hey, don't be angry. And then Joe gets to later in life, and she's angry, and she doesn't actually know what to do with that because it hasn't been validated first. Is that why Marmee's teaching works for Amy and not for Joe? I don't know.
I really wonder, though, if in the second half of the novel, like, Foote seems to be arguing, and I thought it was really interesting, too, that Amy is clearly rewarded more for her gender conformity and she associates that gender conformity, like she says that Marmee taught that, and that's another question. But I can't help but wonder if Joe is better off for the struggle she goes through, and that she becomes a deeper, stronger person for it, and if Amy never really learns more essential things about life. Like, Amy just sails through everything, but Joe gets depressed. She loses Beth, who she relied so much on. I don't know, I just feel I see far more character development in her and more meaning. And like Beth kind of summarizes the meaning of the novel, I think, as Alcott intends, which is that love is all you take with you when you die, and that love is where richness is found. And I feel like Joe has a much deeper, truer love than Amy ever finds.
I think that is true. I think you're definitely right. She does have a much bigger character development, and I think that's why kind of you can kind of feel the favoritism in the book, in that, like, they're all kind of given the same amount of time.
Airtime, yeah.
Yeah, they're all given the same airtime, but, like, everyone's drawn to Jo because she just seemed so much more realistic, at least I was. And I feel like that's partially it, is that she's much more realistic in her struggles, and in, like, in that she does, like, get depressed, and she does, like, lose something hard, and she goes out into the world and she kind of finds success, but she also finds failure. But then, even though she could continue to do that, she has to go home, just because that's the way that life goes sometimes. And I think that realism is what kind of draws you to the character, whereas Amy, like you said, she just sails through.
Yeah, and I don't think Marmee is teaching gender conformity necessarily, and that's really shown when Jo gets so depressed. Marmee doesn't say, hey, you should go off and get married because you're lonely. It's something that Jo arrives at herself. And actually what Marmee says is, why don't you start writing again? That always made you feel better. And I feel like that's really significant.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and I think that's fair. I think it's interesting, though, even to think about, like, gender conformity for Jo, and I think that Foote touches on this later in our article when we get to Professor Bear. He sort of steps into that role of teaching her, like, class, so to speak, and one of his, like, biggest concerns for her is in the way that she's not conforming to, like, this idea of womanhood that her sisters are, and that Marmee has raised her to be, because she's, like, writing these thrillers, you know, what else?
But I wonder if that's a morality that he himself adheres to as a man. And that was my one problem with bringing that up, is that he just thinks it's a moral period. Like, he wouldn't write those sensation stories either. But what I do think is valid to what you're saying, definitely, is that there's one point where Amy and Jo are talking, and the narrator basically says Jo takes her liberty and rejection of social convention to such extremes that she's silly, and that Amy tends to win arguments because she has common sense on her side. And, like, Amy even makes Marmee laugh at herself,
right,
with her common sense, like, because Marmee's saying, well, why should you care what those other girls think of you? And Amy says, you know perfectly well that really does matter, and if you're going to get by in this world, you need to have people like you. So Jo isn't, in that sense, like, the perfect saint, and, like, there is something, like, the narrator is in some ways approving of Amy, which is interesting.
There is a pragmatism to Amy that Jo doesn't have, which is a strange contrast, given that her character is very, like, she's just uninterested in, like, the frivolities that some of her sisters are.
Yes.
But, like, that is a strange distinction, especially given that, like, I think that Amy and Jo can kind of be foils to each other, given that they have the same, like, passionate spirit, but that Amy is much more practical. She knows exactly what she wants. She has the common sense, so she knows how she could go about doing it, and so she just does it. And she does show, like, she isn't completely mercenary. Like, she does reject Fred Vaughn.
Yeah, exactly.
But still, like, Jo is much more romantic. You know, even if she was never focused on romantic love, she is romantic. She wrote romantic stories. She wanted to be a writer. She wanted to be independent. Yeah.
I think this raises an interesting point about how each of them see their role in the world. And I think this is what, I think maybe the heart of Foote's argument here is Jo sees herself as the heroine, which is maybe why we see her as the heroine. Because she's independent, and because she's going to do it her way, always. Whereas Amy has this more pragmatic view of the world. She might not be the heroine all of the time. Sometimes she has to conform to what's around her, and that helps her. It doesn't in the first half, per se. I mean, gets her kicked out of school kind of thing. But in the second half, she gets to go to Europe. She snags the guy next door. And, like, I mean, I don't know. I just, like, however you feel about Jo and Laurie. Like, Laurie's a catch, and Amy snags him. She kind of achieves her goal. Like, she gets what she wants in the end. She wins in the end. By, like, along the way, you know? Like, every once in a while, she just accepts that, like, she has to go with what other people say. She has to please other people. And she talks about how that's important. This is that idea of social debt, that as long as she's paying her debts, she might become the heroine in a way that Jo will never be, because she's so focused on being the hero of the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. What's really fascinating too is that conversation between Joe and Amy in the chapter Calls, where Amy's essentially saying, Joe, if you would budge an inch, you would be even more well liked than me, because there's more depth to you and more to like in you. And like I think Mrs. Lamb likes Joe initially and thinks she's a lot of fun. And she says, oh, Joe, I loved your stories. And Joe, instead of being polite and just throwing a bone and saying, well, thank you, says, no, I hate them, they're trash. Like, basically insulting her. And so I can't help but feel like feminists often want to say, like, oh, Joe shouldn't be domesticated at all. It's so awful that she is. But I do wonder if Amy has a bit of a point in saying, like, if Joe would just budge an inch. And she does end up budging. And I wonder if that's actually a good thing and not a negative thing, like an anti-feminist sort of thing.
Yeah.
that's interesting.
I think it's interesting that you say domesticated, like that we don't want her to be domesticated, but we want her to be like polite or fit into society, because I don't know if those things necessarily have to be synonymous, and I think they often are.
Foote's arguing that.
Foote's arguing that they are,
right.
and that's what's so interesting.
Do we disagree?
I think I might. I think I might, just because I think that Meg is domesticated, but I don't think that she's socialized. And I think that's a choice that she has to make in saying yes to Mr. Brooks.
Yeah.
Because she is relatively isolated. She has her family, and she has Hannah to help, and she has Anne Moffat. Is that her name?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like other than that, she doesn't have
Sally.
Sally.
Whatever.
Oops.
Yes, fine. A Moffat.
Standard white name. I don't know. Oops, I keep bumping that. But like, I think that you can't necessarily equate the same things, because I don't want Jo to be domesticated. I don't want her spirit to be broken, but I do want her to realize the use of being polite, and beyond just like mercenary, like I want to get what I want, and to do that as a woman in this world, you need to be able to kind of like win hearts a little bit. But I think also just like understanding that people at their core want to feel like they are welcome. And like as an author, that's what she's doing. She's trying to create worlds where people who may not always be welcome can be welcomed into these new places, whether that be in fantasy, whether that be abroad, whether that be in a different time period. And so I think she's just kind of missing what is actually like good about being like knowing the social rules. And I think also that like Marmee kind of misses it too. Like she does tell Amy that like, oh, well, you don't need those girls to like you, they're silly. And Amy's like, that's not true. I'm a poor girl. Like, yeah, I need them. I need them to like me.
Yeah.
But like also understanding that like beyond just like wanting to get what you want, other people have the capacity to show you things that you won't expect.
Yeah, and like I know feminist critics don't tend to like that analogy when, it's when Jo's talking to Meg in the chapter where she's depressed, and Meg's saying to her, you have this prickly outside and the soft inside. I think what they don't like is that it's talking about Jo and Dr. Bear and her becoming open to marriage. But I wonder if it also applies to her becoming more open to other people. And if there's a sort of, because when she first leaves for New York, she feels insecure around other people, which really surprised me, and that she lacked a certain confidence. And I wonder if there's something about Jo that's closed off to the world, and that she does actually need to learn to grow up and leave her kind of safe little space.
I think Foote touches on this, that New York actually becomes the sphere of Jo's, like, education morally. And this is interesting now, too, if we're differentiating between, like, this idea of social status and, like, just, like, being a good person. This kind of idea of classiness. But, like, yeah, once she goes to New York, I think that's the first time, yes, we have Professor Bear and everything, but that we start to see Jo being open to, like, people around her and a little bit more welcoming, and she comes back a little bit softer, and, like, that's the phase of, like, softening for her, I think, in a way that, like, previously she's been really prickly.
Well, and I wonder if her writing was actually a way of hiding and, like, a refuge, and she needed to lose that. She needed to lose her writing to become a full, like, human being. And I know a lot of people don't like that she gives up on writing, but I wonder if that was essential to her growing as a person. And not just her accepting Dr. Bear.
Ooh, that's interesting. I feel like we're, we have so many more questions. Like, we could just keep going.
Yeah.
Because it's like...
Well, and we got into Jo and writing, and oh goodness.
Oh my gosh.
So many thoughts on that.
But I feel like we concluded, Kathleen, your point was super interesting.
Yes.
That this all, like, Foote is trying to say that the domestic sphere and the social sphere bleed into one another seamlessly, but I think Meg is a great counterpoint to that. But the fact that she even raises that question has really opened up a lot of conversation about the relationship between the domestic sphere and the exterior world, and like how each girl grows in that transition, and how Meg almost doesn't make that transition.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And whether you can equate them, you know, like, does being a woman of the domestic sphere make you ready to be a woman of the social sphere? Because for Amy, I think we see yes, and like that's like Amy embraces the characteristics. I think she does it opposite.
I was gonna say
first she embraces the social sphere, and that prepares her to enter into this domestic household, and really like shepherd her own life and be this generous benefactor to people like her who want to move up in the world but don't really know how but are well-intentioned, kind of thing. And the lessons she learns through preparing to be someone of upper class, so to speak, actually just prepare her to be this kind of tender-hearted, generous but practical woman. And for Jo, I think Meg, maybe it's the opposite. She's ready for the domestic and not the social. And then maybe Jo is somewhere in the middle. Is she ready for either before? Like, I don't know if she's ever ready for one or the other before the other. Does that make sense? Like, I think she's sort of coming into her own in this social world by figuring out that she doesn't necessarily want to be this famous writer who's only writing trash, and Professor Bear is helping her realize that, while at the same time realizing she didn't really think she wanted to get married. But as she's realizing that she's not exactly happy with where she is in the social world, she's starting to embrace more of the domestic sphere, and they're kind of coming together at the same time for her.
Yeah, one last point, and then we can wrap it up. But I think when you were saying that, something that came to mind was, yes, I think Meg conquers domestic, and I don't know if she ever will the social, just because, like, economically she's kind of limited from it.
Yeah.
Whereas Amy conquers the social, and then we see her going into the domestic. And I think Beth understands that those two are not the same thing, and that's why she wants to hide in the home. She's like, I don't want to leave my family. I'm comfortable here. I don't want my own domestic sphere. I like this one right now. And I don't want to go out to the social sphere. And I don't think that Jo recognizes the two as different things. And I think that's part of why.
And she just wants to conquer everything.
Yeah, she's like, she's so confused about, like, she doesn't want to be married, but she does want to, like, rule the world. And so she's kind of tripping over her own feet because she sees them as the same thing and doesn't know how to do one without the other. Yeah,
because practically, can you? In this era, can you rule the world as a strong, independent, single woman? So good. Okay, well, we could keep going, but I feel like we're...
Yeah, I think one last comment I might want to make is that the Foote is trying to argue that the classiness which Marmee has instilled in them has to do with gender conformity. And I think we've kind of raised up the idea that classiness is kind of, like Natalie said, just being a good person, and that doesn't necessarily mean gender conformity. And I think the center of the novel really is displayed in Beth, who says that it's love that unites everything, and it's love that makes your existence in different spheres meaningful. Like, even Meg's limited existence in the domestic sphere, even if you think it's problematic in some ways, it's love that makes it meaningful. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you guys. I feel like that was so good.
So fun.
Oh, yay.